With the world's largest economy, hundreds of overseas military bases, and leadership positions in various international institutions, the United States is an undeniable global superpower. But back in the day, it wasn't always like this. Early US presidents like George Washington himself shielded the nation from international affairs like getting involved in Europe's great power conflicts. Instead, early American leaders focused on developing the then young nation's economy and expanding its domestic territory. The US foreign policy was focused on getting Europe's imperial powers out of the Western Hemisphere. In their worldview, the Atlantic and Pacific Ocean served not as barriers to international leadership, but rather as invaluable buffers that would allow the country to grow free of foreign interference. And indeed, the United States grew through negotiation, purchase, conflict, and conquest. The country more than tripled in size between 1783 and 1853. Its economy took off after the Civil War between 1865 and 1898. Coal production rose by 800%, and railway track mileage rose by 567%. By the middle of the 1880s, the US had surpassed Britain as the world's leading producer of manufactured goods and steel. But despite its growing wealth, the US still steered clear of foreign entanglement. So when did the United States begin to take a more active role in affairs beyond its shores? I'll tell you why. It's thanks to three wars that happened between 1898 and 1945. The first one is the Spanish-American War. In the early 1800s, when the US was still a young and vulnerable country, it constantly faced threats from far wealthier and militarily superior European empires, which were the British, the French, and the Spanish, which all controlled territory in the region, from which they had profited immensely. This European competition troubled US presidents who viewed the Americas as their backyard and rightful sphere of influence. In 1823, President James Monroe warned Europe's empires not to meddle in the region, and further colonization would be viewed as a hostile act against the United States. However, the so-called Monroe Doctrine, although bold, was largely dismissed by Europeans, because the United States couldn't act on these threats. Remember, in 1820, the US accounted for only just under 2% of the global gross domestic product. But slowly but surely, this power dynamic shifted throughout the 19th century, when national independence movements expelled Europe's empires from their colonies in the region. Meanwhile, technological innovations such as steamboats, passenger trains, and factory machines transformed the United States from an agrarian country to an industrial one. However, these changes helped spark newfound prosperity that enabled the US expansion across North America. With this power, the United States began to look beyond its shores. In 1853, American Commodore Matthew Perry sailed a contingent of the US Navy to Japan. Perry's voyage resulted in the opening of diplomatic and trading relations after threatening to attack the island nation, which had been largely closed off to the Western world for the previous 200 years. Throughout the 1890s, influential Americans began to call for the United States to acquire geopolitical influence in order to commensurate with its economic strength. As one sign of this stirring ambition, Congress began to approve the construction of battleship vessels capable of taking on the fleets of other great powers. The United States put these new warships to use in 1898, launching a war to expel Spain from Cuba. The exact causes of the Spanish-American War are still in dispute. At the time, certain American leaders justified their war efforts by pointing to the explosion of a warship, the USS Maine, for which they initially blamed Spain, but almost certainly incorrectly. Others argued the United States had a responsibility to support Cuban revolutionaries who were rebelling against the Spanish colonizers. Either way, by declaring war, the United States seized an opportunity to remove the last vestiges of the Spanish Empire from the Caribbean and the Pacific. The war would cement American influence in the two regions. After just months of fighting, a defeated Spain agreed to leave Cuba and to cede additional Caribbean and Pacific territories to the United States. As a result, Guam, the Philippines, and Puerto Rico became U.S. possessions. That same year, the United States also annexed the independent country of Hawaii. After annexing these lands, the U.S. established military bases and coaling stations for American merchants and warships. Nonetheless, by the turn of the 20th century, United States controlled a territory spanning 10,000 miles from Puerto Rico to the Philippines. Its economy had surpassed the United Kingdom's to become the world's largest. Economic growth was supercharged by increased production of steel and the adoption of new sources of power like oil. The United States boasted a powerful and tested navy which could defend U.S. interests both in the Americas and now further afield. After the events of 1898, Presidents William Howard Taft and Woodrow Wilson turned away from expansionism. In particular, Wilson succeeded in keeping the United States out of World War I from 1914 to 1917. Amid a devastating conflict in Europe, Washington adhered to an isolationist approach similar to that of the 19th century. So, why did Wilson, a president who successfully ran for re-election in 1916 on the slogan that he kept the United States out of war, abruptly change course in 1917 and bring the US into Europe's greatest conflict of that time? Two main factors motivated Wilson's decisions. First and foremost, Germany had sunk US ships in the Atlantic Ocean, which threatened both American lives and business interests. The second reason is that the British intercepted a secret message known as the Zimmermann Telegram. This message revealed that Germany offered to support Mexico into taking over US territory if Germany and Mexico formed a wartime alliance. Ultimately, the United States entered World War I on the 6th of April 1917. That decision helped the Allies turn the tide of the war. It also afforded the United States a leading role in the eventual peace talks in which Wilson set out to shape the post-war international order. With Europe in disarray, Wilson outlined an idealistic vision for the future. In his 1918 14-point speech, Wilson called for imperialism to be dismantled. Wilson then notably proposed the creation of an international organization dedicated to peaceful diplomacy and collective security. This institution would be called the League of Nations. Although Wilson succeeded in creating the League of Nations, he failed to secure needed public and congressional support for the U.S. membership in the organization. After the Great Depression, the United States returned to isolationism, seeking to separate itself from the rising tide of militarism and fascism that swept Europe and Asia during the 1930s. Congress of that time passed a series of neutrality acts aimed at ensuring that the United States would stand apart from foreign conflicts. The United States also embraced protectionist economic policies, which further withdrew the country from the global economy. Thus, the United States turned inward. As fighting erupted in Asia and Europe in the 1930s, the United States remained on the sidelines of World War II until 1941. Japan bombed the U.S. naval base of Pearl Harbor, killing around 2,400 troops. The attack also damaged and destroyed dozens of planes and warships. Just one day later, the United States issued a declaration of war against Japan. Soon thereafter, the United States was at war with Germany and Italy after both declared war on the United States. At the same time, Adolf Hitler's Nazi Germany had enjoyed a series of military success. However, when the US troops landed in Europe in early 1942, the tide slowly began to shift against the Axis powers. Germany soon found itself caught between a Soviet counteroffensive in the east and a US-led offensive in the west. Germany ultimately surrendered on May 7, 1945. Japan followed soon thereafter, surrendering on August 14th after the United States dropped atomic bombs on the cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. President Harry Truman decided to deploy atomic weapons to avoid a Kashi invasion of Japan. By the war's end, some 16 million Americans served in Europe and the Pacific. As the smoke cleared, the United States stood victorious and with unprecedented global power. In addition to towering as the world's military heavyweight, the United States boasted the most valuable currency, the dollar, to which all other major currencies had become fixed to. In addition, the country's economy had taken off during World War II, nearly doubling in size between 1939 and 1945. In stark contrast, Western Europe's economy contracted by 18%, and Japan's economy was cut in half. This economic and military strength uniquely positioned the United States to promote post-war peace and prosperity. And this time, instead of retreating to the Western Hemisphere as it did following World War I, the US resolved to prop Europe back up and rebuild Japan. After World War II, the US took the lead in creating a series of international institutions to promote cooperation on global issues, specifically the United Nations, the World Bank, and International Monetary Fund. The United States has championed this global system of multilateral institutions known as the liberal world order for the past 75 years. At the close of World War II, the deadliest conflict in human history, the British Prime Minister Winston Churchill himself declared that the United States stood at the summit of the world.